Here are some tips on reading for class. So, uh, I'll use a few examples because I think it might be easier to help you adapt your needs based off of the type of book that you have to read for a class. So, the first example is a graphic novel called Abina and the Imported Men. It's a graphic novel that tells a story of an African woman's quest for freedom. Um, in this period that's right in between the end of the Atlantic slave trade and the beginning of colonization. And what I usually do when I read books, and if I have limited time, but I want to make sure that I leave with an understanding of having read something. I definitely always check out the cover, always read reviews on the back. And I'll give you an example. So Abina, the Imported Men, this is a graphic novel. As such, you see it has illustrations on the cover. And then on the back, sometimes academic books will have some um, references or some institutions or people that have supported the text and say that say it's reputable, uh, deserving, thoughtful, worth considering, worth reading. And so the back of this book has several. The first comes from the American Historical Association. It says, weaving together a court transcript from 1876, Abana's story before the trial within the broader context of gender, colonialism, and world history, the book shares historical evidence as well as interpretation to present a powerful tool for teaching history and teaching about history. So that one review helps prepare me as a reader to a lot of things. It tells me first, wow, this book is based off of a court case about this one person's life. It tells me when, 1876. It tells me what this story does, why it's so important. Every book has a so what. According to the American Historical Association, this book is important because it helps provide a broader context for us to understand what gender is, how colonialism was shaped, and how colonialism existed, what it looked like, how this one individual, Abana, experienced it, what her story tells us about world history during this time period. And also, the thing I find really fascinating is how this text helps us to see how history is taught. It teaches history, it teaches a kind of history that relates to gender, colonialism, right? But it also is about history, how history is made. So that's what the American Historical Association. And then I'll read the other reviews, maybe take some little side notes on the side or highlight, keep that in mind. So while I'm reading, if I see things that help me understand gender, colonialism, or world history, I would like check a box because I know I'm digging into this. Of course, I also read the inside covers. Then I will read a preface and or any other kind of opening content. Oh, look, the inside of this book also has similar kind of references or reviews from historians. It's maybe harder for you to see here, but I would skim. Honestly, I wouldn't read all of those. I may skim a couple, see what they say. And then I dig into, oh, look, it has a letter to the reader. Dear reader, this graphic history recounts the story of Amina Mansa, a young woman who lived in West Africa during the late 19th century. Now, this gets into what I do next in terms of reading. I may read the first sentence of each paragraph, which is called the topic sentence. The topic sentence tells you what the entire rest of the paragraph is about. So, a well written text allows you to read the first sentence of each paragraph and still have a kind of feeling of flow. So, and this is a well written text. This graphic history recounts the story of Abina Mansa, a young woman who lived in West Africa during the late 19th century. The next topic sentence says, in the last few decades, however, historians have developed new strategies for learning about the experiences and perspectives of quote unquote people without history. And people without history is in bold. So that tells me somewhere in the prior paragraph, um, I'm there was a story that was about people that are presumed to have a history and people that are presumed not to have a history. So I'm learning this is something that's significant and important to this book. Also, Abina and the Important Men is one of a number of projects that seek to find a middle ground between scholarly and popular histories of regular people. So that tells us also why this book is important. This is the second edition of Abina and the Important Men. And we see this work as a conversation we are having with Abina. And so I know this may feel kind of like vague and brief, but you've learned a lot from looking at each one of those topic sentences. And that helps you to kind of frame where you're going. Now, the rest of this is honestly a graphic novel, and it's instructive to read each box. So, this is why I'm giving you a variety of types of examples. I would encourage you to read each box, look at each illustration. This graphic novels aren't for speed reading, okay? But in the back part, there are some sections that do historical context. In the previous two sections of the book, you've encountered primary sources, secondary sources. Primary source is a document from the 19th century that purports, well, in this context, the primary sources are from the 19th century because you're learning about Abina. So primary sources are sources from the 19th century that purports to be an eyewitness description of what happened in the courtroom with Abina when she appeared. And then the secondary sources is the secondary source itself is the graphic novel. So this is a source that's based off of primary research. And so this contextualizes that. So that's one way if you have a type of text. So a graphic novel is one example. Another way, this is a kind of a traditional academic text, but it's for a popular audience, Beacon Press out of Boston. Also subsidiary, I mean, I think it's a part of, I know it's a part of Harvard, but it's a more popular press side of it. So this book is called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History by Jeanne Theoharis. And similarly, I would read the back. I also look at the cover, make my own notes about it as this all helps me as a reader prepare myself for what's on the inside, right? So the back says the civil rights movement has become a national legend, lauded by presidents from Reagan to Obama to Trump as proof of the power of American democracy. The fable features dreamy heroes and accidental heroines, has shuttered the movement firmly in the past, whitewashed the focus that stood in the way, and diminished its scope. Historian Jeanne Theoharis dissects this national myth making, teasing apart the accepted stories to show them in a strikingly different light. Tracing the complex reality of the movement, the power of its organizing, and the beauty and scope of its vision, Theoharis reveals that there is nothing natural or inevitable about the progress that occurred. In unearthing our civil rights legacy, a beautiful, more terrible history, holds an uncomfortable mirror to the nation, underscoring the crucial work that remains to be done. So that tells what this book is about, why it's considered important, and how but we don't know how yet, right? How this author is going to do this work. We just know what the goal is and why they say it matters. And then there's other references of people who've read it, putting their perspective. And I usually do read those. It's a nice way to frame it. Going to the preface, that's what I usually check out next. Sometimes, since this is an academic text that has a more kind of traditional flow to it, it's not a graphic novel, right? I'll definitely look at the table of the contents and if there's a list of illustrations just to help me see where I'm going. So the preface is called A Dream Diluted and Distorted. Introduction is the histories that we get, the political use and misuse of civil rights history and memorialization to the present. So if I look at that, I probably would underline misuses, political uses, memorialization. Those are big themes. And if I don't know what they mean, I will look them up. I would look them up to see what they mean so I can understand what the chapters are about. It's really, really hard to understand a thing that you've been assigned to read if there's words in it that you don't understand and you don't look them up. So I encourage you to just, take a minute. If you're coming across something, you read it, you see a word, big word, look it up. And as you learn those big words, you also will incorporate them in your vocabulary. So there's a benefit to slowing down sometimes. It makes the reading easier in the long run. Chapter 1 is the histories we need. So the introduction was the histories we get. Chapter 1, and this next section is the histories we need. The long movement from outside the South, fighting for school desegregation in the quote unquote liberal North. So that tells you where the chapter is beginning. Wow, this book is going to look at civil rights as an issue, not just in the South, but also in the North. Chapter 2, revisiting the uprising of the 1960s and the long history of injustice and the struggle that preceded them. Chapter 3, beyond looking at the polite racism of a kind of quote unquote white moderate, right? Makes me think of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That's what chapter 3 is on. Chapter 4, the media was often an obstacle to the struggle for racial justice. That's going to examine that topic. Chapter 5, beyond the bus seat, the movement, press for desegregation, criminal justice, economic justice, and global justice. So that's going beyond this kind of inside the U.S. border. 6, great man view of history. Where are the young people? ? 7, great man view of history. Where are the women? ? Chapter 8, extremists, troublemakers, national security threats, the public demonization of rebels, and the toll it took. Government repression of the movement. That's chapter 8. Chapter 9, learning to play on locked pianos. The movement was persevering, organized, and disparaged, and other lessons from the Montgomery bus boycott. So, wow, chapter 9 is going to loop back and right back up in Montgomery, as a kind of like iconic way to think about the movement. And then the afterword, a history for a better world. This outline tells me where I'm going, what the chapters are covering, what the topics are. If there's anything that really stands out to me because of my quote unquote research or my own interest, I at this point would decide I may skim these other sections, but I'm definitely going to read like as much of this one chapter as possible. That's when you make these kinds of decisions. And you do this early, so you give yourself enough time. Give yourself enough time to read more fully the stuff that you really want to read fully, right? So this isn't a thing that you do the night before and then you just skim and this requires planning. So going to this preface, dreamed, eluded, and distorted. This preface opens with a quote. 2 quotes actually. The first by Galeano, which says, "It's a system of power that is always deciding in the name of humanity who deserves to be remembered and who deserves to be forgotten. We are much more than we are told. We are much more beautiful." And the second quote is from James Baldwin. "American history is longer, larger, and more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it." And so we recognize that as a quote. That's the quote from the actual cover of the book, A Beautiful, More Terrible History. So, okay, wow, the title of the book is based off of a Baldwin quote. We learned that, write that on the margins. Going back to that topic sentence style I said, read the first sentence of each paragraph. If I'm reading something that is a kind of traditional academic text that's popular press, definitely read the full introduction paragraph, that first introduction paragraph. Then I read the conclusion paragraph, and then I go back and check out the topic sentences, the first sentence of each paragraph. Why? Because the introduction tells you where you're going, the conclusion tells you where you ended, and the topic sentence tells you the whole arc, the whole flow of the story. By the turn of the millennium, the history of the civil rights movement had become a national story. When asked to name a quote unquote most famous American other than the president, quote unquote, from Columbus to today, High school students most often choose Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. Students choose two freedom fighters who in life had challenged the racial injustice at the heart of American society, who had often been treated as, quote unquote, being un American for doing so. Now, the civil rights movement had come to embody American grit, courage, and resolve, and these two activists could be invoked as the country's most famous emblems. So that's where we began. Probably would jot down a couple notes that helped me think about that opening. And then conclusion, last paragraph of the end of this chapter, not the conclusion of the book, y'all. Okay. So go to the end of the chapter, read the last paragraph. While the civil rights movement is regularly celebrated for the way it demonstrates the power of ordinary Americans to challenge the course of the nation, what a host of activists did and how they did it is far more beautiful than we've been taught. The terrible diversity of people and forces that stood in the movement's way have been papered over as well. In an America of disproportionate Black poverty and persistent school inequality, with a criminal justice system riven with inequalities, and an imperial foreign policy that justifies far-ranging constitutional abuses and record numbers of deportations, a fuller history of the movement is imperative for seeing a way forward. In an America that, across party lines, asserts its own exceptionalism, this history reveals longstanding investment in and deflection of racial injustice domestically and globally. And so we need this history more now than ever. And then if you go back to each topic sentence, so that tells you where it started, where we're ending, arguably beginning when President Ronald Reagan signed the bill in 1983 to make the third Monday of January a federal holiday for Martin Luther King Jr., the political uses of memorializing the movement took on heightened possibility as a national narrative. Next topic sentence. At the same time, memorials to the civil rights movement became national events, from President Bill Clinton's trip to Little Rock for the 40th anniversary of Little Rock 9's desegregation of Central High School, to Congress's decision to have Rosa Parks' coffin lie in honor in the Capitol, to the first family's trip to Selma, Alabama on the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. Next topic sentence. Political leaders, pundits, and citizens came to see and tell the story of the modern civil rights movement as one of progress and national redemption. Next topics. A story that should have reflected the immense injustices at the nation's core and the enormous lengths people had gone to attack them had become a flattering mirror. Next topic sentence. In the process, politicians and others shrank the progressive, expansive, challenging vision of the modern Black freedom struggle into some of the things that are more passive, individualistic, privatized, dream diluted and distorted. That returns back to this title. So at this point, I want to make sure I understand everything I've read, and I see that this is kind of a critique of what it is to do memorials, because it's calling out the fact that there's all these memorials that are happening to a movement, but there's not as much focus on the unfulfilled hopes of the events. And we see that reflected in some of these sentences I just read. The recounting of national histories is never separate from present day politics. So it is having a memorial for the sake of a memorial, this author is saying, ignores the original goal of the movement before the memorial. So this author is saying, let's pay attention to what we're actually memorializing and what the actual state of the moment is. Racial injustice is America's original sin and its deepest silence. No better proof of our country's progress was the election of the president of Barack Obama. The public who elected him rejoiced in it. Many people, President Obama included, didn't subscribe to this kind of a post-racial idea. So you see how you're doing these topic sentences. There's some stuff that you're missing in the middle, but it becomes clear as you read each one, either what ideas you've missed based off of context clues. Or if it's not clear, that's when you pause and go back and read the previous paragraph. And so understand that this is a method that can be used and adapted. Now, this next text that's an example is Reckoning with Slavery, Gender and Kinship, and Capitalism in the Early Black Atlantic by Jennifer L. Morgan. Again, I would always check out the cover, there's artwork here, and understand that this is, while there's art, I wonder if this is going to have more examples of Black material culture or material culture that represents Blackness and Black womanhood in it. Those kind of questions that start jogging in my mind. On the back, we also see a kind of brief summary of what this book is about. In Reckoning with Slavery, Jennifer L. Morgan draws on the lived experiences of enslaved African women in the 16th and 17th centuries to reveal the contours of early modern notions of trade, race, and commodification in the Black Atlantic. So that's the three areas that I'm really going to want to focus on as I read this text. What is this book teaching me about the idea of trade? I'm assuming the slave trade, right? What does this teach me about race? What does it teach me about commodification in the Black Atlantic? Commodification, thinking of commodities. And if I don't know what commodification means, I'm going to go look it up real quickly so I can have a little definition. So when I see it again, it reminds me what it means. Black Atlantic. What is Black Atlantic? I might search that too. I know what the Atlantic is. What's Black Atlantic? Might this have something to do with the transatlantic slave trade? Now of course, we read these things not in a vacuum. We're reading these in a class, right? So whatever your assignments are for a class, make sure that while you're going through and making your notes, you focus on, okay, wait, what's on the syllabus for this week? What should I be paying attention to? What did the professor say my theme should be as well? But I know it's going to cover this, this, and this. And so moving on. From capture to transport to the sale of childbirth, these women were demographically counted as commodities during the Middle Passage. Speaking of African women, they were vulnerable to rape. They were separated from their kin at slave markets, subject to laws that enslaved their children upon birth. In this way, they were central to the binding of reproductive labor with kinship, racial hierarchy, and economies of slavery. Throughout the groundbreaking study, Morgan demonstrates that there is a development of Western notions of value and race that occurred simultaneously. In so doing, she illustrates how racial capitalism denied the enslaved their kinship and these kind of effective ties while simultaneously relying on kinship to reproduce and enforce slavery through enslaved female bodies. That's full. I probably would either write some of these highlights down, like just jot them down as bullet points, or draw notes, arrows, write certain words and show how they're connected before even opening the book. Because this very brief paragraph on the back helps me understand the bigger vision of the book. And I would follow through just like with this, like I did with this. I would check out the table of contents. I would go to the preface, read the preface, check out the introduction, read the introduction paragraph in the introduction, read the concluding paragraph, read the first line of each sentence, take brief notes. When I say brief notes, there's a thing like a Pomodoro clock, Pomodoro. If you Google that, there's these little time blocks. When I say brief, I mean set your little Pomodoro timer, 20 minutes, 25, 15, 10. After you've read your section, set your clock. Write as many notes as you can fit in that time step, and then move on. Move on. Move on to the next chapter. Do the same thing. Intro, conclusion, topic sentence. Move on. Move on. And then make sure you do the same thing with the conclusion. And that is not reading every word, right? Depending on what we do when we are in school, sometimes we don't honestly have time to read every word. And I know it can be embarrassing or frustrating depending on our capacity to read, especially if we're slow readers. I was a slow reader, okay? So I honestly don't remember who taught me this method, but somebody taught me this method and it helped me deeply in grad school. And you'll find that you'll get better at it and better at it. And eventually you'll find that there's some sections that you want to read every single word and you want to go back to, be very precise, look at the footnotes, um, look at citations, go follow citations, maybe, in other ways. But then there's some things that you need to know in order to understand it, but this isn't a thing that you need to know in order to implement all the way to the ground. And so that's up for you to figure out. That's up for you. That is your own work to prioritize, like how much of the thing you need to know and to what end you need to understand it. I will say that it can become it's almost it was for me impossible to read every word and walk away being able to make a succinct, thoughtful, clear argument. So this method helped me be more clear about main ideas and to help me better understand what the not just what the main point was, but how it was constructed. One thing I didn't say within these introductions is introductions will tell you how the author came to the topic. Sometimes, especially the preface will do that, but they'll also tell you what their archive is. What did they study in order to make this argument? What arguments are they making? What's their method? What's their approach? How did they look at what sources did they look at and how did they look at those sources? That's methodology or method. You'll see that in the introduction. You'll also see their findings are broken down by chapter based off of this archive, applying this method, asking this question. I discovered these outcomes tell this, support this one argument that is a thesis. The outcomes being broken down and articulated and illustrated through chapters being organized. So I hope this is helpful and less obscure than saying go read. And if it is, please feel free to drop, some feedback in the comment section. And if there's other ways to do this that you have found equally as helpful, please feel free to drop that in the chat box as well. Best of luck with your reading.